Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from here on this big, beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlocked Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Hey, I think I want to deal with an issue that you don't hear that much about, at least in the movies, because, well, the movie industry itself is not going to want to really attack itself all that much. But ultimately, I would like to actually question America's love affair with Hollywood. That's right. I think it's quite ironic that in our nation, we consider, the average person is politically far more conservative, socially far more conservative, religiously far more conservative than you would find the average person in the Hollywood industry. And yet we still watch the entertainment that's created and just kind of, I don't know, maybe it's some sort of cognitive dissonance. We just kind of push it aside when there's either overt or subliminal propagandizing within the movies and TV shows. Well, what I'd like to do is go into an analysis of Hollywood and maybe explain why it is the way it is. And therefore, you can come to your own conclusions when it comes to, is it deserving of all the glamour and glitz that we seem to afford it? Anyway, before I begin, I'd like to encourage people, if you're listening to this later on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to this channel so you can keep up with future programs that come on. And also, at the bottom, I'll put a link to my official website. And you can check articles out there that are related to this subject, psychopathy, psychology, and many more topics. Also, hey, one other thing. Product placement, just like they do in Hollywood, thanks to Edward Bernays. If you like science fiction that may be a little challenging in regards to a lot of our assumptions about what the ancient past was like, check out my sci-fi book, The Destiny of Our Past. And you can, just Google that or check in on Amazon. So anyway, on to Hollywood. Now, the thing is, Hollywood is an industry just like any other. It creates a product. That product is driven by the profit motive. Now, it's kind of ironic, really. We have a lot of movie stars who will come out and they condemn the American system in many respects because they say it's too capitalistic. They'll condemn people for not paying more attention to various social causes and so forth. But the people that are really successful and the ones that are actually the ones who you recognize their names, you can just go ahead and check what their net worth is. Many of these people are extremely, extremely wealthy. All right. In fact, maybe surprisingly so. I think if you ask the average person how rich the movie stars are that you might think of in the top, few dozen, both actors and actresses, they might think, oh, well, they have a few $1 million. And I think you'd be surprised if you actually look it up to see how much they actually are worth. So they've done quite well with capitalism. Also, I think one thing we fail to recognize too is that the movie stars are very similar to pro athletes. Now, professional athletes make a lot of money because they pull in audience. Okay, it's the same thing. Hollywood and pro athletics are pretty much the same thing, except the outcome might be different. In a movie, you know what the outcome's going to be. You can watch it over and over and over again. It's scripted. In professional athletics, you don't know. Maybe this team will win or that team will win. So there's a difference there. But you're still having people who are paid a great deal of money because they're good at running with a ball or passing a ball or delivering a line and having that kind of on-stage charisma that will bring in audience. Now, of course, in both cases, they're getting paid money. Yes, a lot of it. But at the same time, they're making money for people in the background. All right? Just like a sports team is owned and operated by someone, the movie studios, they too are putting these actors and actresses out there in order to make lots of money for themselves and people who buy in. I guess you could say the shareholders in the industry. Now, again, there's an irony to this idea that, Hollywood should be considered so, much politically to the left when it's benefited tremendously by the whole notion of supply and demand. Because the public does actually demand entertainment. We have a lot of free time nowadays. And, it was kind of ironic that, the Hollywood, I'm not going to go into a lot of history here, but Thomas Edison, kind of when you're thinking about the height of the Industrial Revolution, bringing in all kinds of new things, he held patents to a lot of the important instruments that are needed to make movies. And he was very, very strict about how the patents could be used and applied. And I believe he was in New Jersey. And so when you had various independent people thinking, oh, I can make movies, I can make money off this, Edison would crack down if they were using it outside of the bounds that he had set. And so essentially he was using copyright to make sure that he made his money. Now, because of all of the hassles that these people went through, what they did was they decided to go out west. And they settled in an area that was known for chicken farming. And that was Hollywood. Remember, Los Angeles, as you see it today, in 1900, was more of a whole bunch of communities that, would eventually grow together into one big megalopolis. So Hollywood was, had a lot of chicken farms and stuff. And, if you went across the continent, the enforcement was far harder to force people to comply with. So then, essentially, the movie industry as we know it was born out of a desire to, get away from copyright. Now, eventually, of course, these copyrights expired and so forth, and new technology came along, and you had the movie industry evolve. And the advantage Hollywood has is that it, unlike maybe some of the movie industries like, I don't know, in Sweden, for instance, that produced really, really high quality entertainment. When it switched to movies that had dialogue, where it was no longer silent anymore, the fact that you had such a big audience that was English speaking and native in the United States meant that you wound up generating much more money. And of course, in business, if you generate more money, then you can generate more money because you can offer more innovation and make more money in the process. So a lot of the smaller countries that had movie industries, whereas it didn't destroy them, it made them less important in a worldwide scale. Now, that being said, a little bit of a history lesson. I've got to note, I think I brought up something there earlier about product placement, Edward Bernays. The economic aspects of film are tremendous, but the social impacts are as well. But let me first mention the thing about product placement and then go into how socially things are promoted in Hollywood movies. And that's been going on ever since they started. Now, if we take a look at Edward Bernays, he started this idea of putting clothing lines that he had contracts with. Remember, Remember, he was a marketer and he had lots of clients. And so, I mean, he affected culture a lot. Look up Edward Bernays bacon breakfast food. It's amazing how many things he really affected. Or you could look up Edward Bernays women smoking. I mean, so many different things that we've done several shows on Edward Bernays here. But you show movie stars dressed in certain clothing that's produced by his clients, and the more people see it, the more that affects trends, because people like to be trendy. I remember reading a long time ago that where short hair came in Europe during the 1800s, because long flowing hair was not the style until, my gosh, I mean, not until practically the 1960s. It was not usual. So what happened was a lot of women were arrested during the French Revolution if they had any kind of connections that could be seen as being part of the establishment when the king was overthrown. Now, in many cases, in fact, probably most cases, from my understanding, you could get arrested and later exonerated. Kind of like, okay, well, whatever. But it was kind of capricious. So someone that maybe had even royal family connections in one community might be let go because, well, she didn't cause much trouble, whereas another one who had very, very distant connections to the power structure might have her head chopped off in the guillotine. Now, the thing was that you had all these women from the upper class. They were spending time in jail during this reign of terror. And stories went out about guillotines getting stuck in women's hair. So, I mean, if you think about that, if the guillotine comes down and it gets stuck, maybe it doesn't kill you immediately. So it might crush your neck and then you're going to suffocate, or it might just cut through somewhat. So what women did was they cut their hair really short in order to not have any problem. In case they were executed, at least it would be quick. I mean, instantaneous death. Now, when these women were released, for the most part, and went back into normal society, the commoners, the regular people, even though you had this situation where, they were whipped up into this frenzy of let's knock out the elite, we're still, they were still trained, or we tend to look up to people at the apex of the power structure. We protect those at the apex of the power structure, unless it is a revolution such as that. But still, in people's minds, they see all these elite women with really short hair. And so that's where the whole thing started, with being, if you wanted to be sophisticated, you cut your hair short. Now, again, it didn't mean that you shaved your head like, maybe some protester at a campus or something nowadays. Some of the women seem to have a thing about shaving their heads. But what it was that their hair was maybe down to maybe shoulder length or something like that. And so that illustrates just how powerful role models are. And that usually it's from the bottom up that we see things. And therefore we want to be like what we see, because that confers status. And in a society, generally people are wanting to be part of the status structure. Being outside of the status structure means far less comfort. It's far less security. Traditionally, it meant far less reproduction. If you're a guy, it's like, oh, I'm just going to totally rebel against society. Well, maybe a father's got a daughter and he's thinking, well, I don't really want her to be with you. And so your chances of reproduction were even lessened. We'll have a show about that later. But no matter where it comes from, there is this sense of wanting to follow what is the norms that we have. Now, traditionally, people lived in communities where the norms were pretty evident. The people around your community, how did they dress? How did they behave? How did they speak? And so you could travel from one part of a state and travel to another part of the state, and the people might speak completely different. I mean, they're speaking English, maybe not. But if the English they're speaking might have a different accent just from one town to another, or region to another region. And this homogeneity that we think of when it comes to the English language in the United States is actually relatively new. Nowadays, we see people speaking kind of the same English. There might be a slight difference, but that difference is disappearing. At least you can understand people from the mountains of Tennessee, which I've heard some recordings of music from the 1930s in Tennessee. And oh my gosh, I seriously, I had just as hard a time understanding what they were saying as I would if someone was talking in very strong Cockney English. So anyway, people tend to emulate what they see on the screen, because suddenly now that very small number of people that you're used to seeing is now in your living room. Well, I shouldn't say living room, at least in the 1930s. My apologies to Joe Biden, who said that people watched Franklin Roosevelt in 1929, a little earlier anyway, on TV. If they were watching him on TV, they were using some sort of time machine or something to do it. But anyway, the thing is, you go to the theater and suddenly you're seeing something that's produced far away in Hollywood, but that same theater, the same movie, is playing maybe in your little community in North Dakota, a community in northern Idaho, or someplace in the mountains of Tennessee. And this started creating not just more and more of an idea of what English was like, but also how you should dress, how you should behave. I mentioned the comment about Edward Bernays and smoking. They wanted to get women to smoke more. Well, heck, they wanted everyone to smoke more in those days. The tobacco industry was making a lot more cigarettes than they could possibly sell. So what they did was show people in movies smoking. And then you show styles, and you show all of these other things. And for better or for worse, I mean, I've dealt with this before, that the idea of women shaving their legs or shaving their underarms is not something that you would have found very common before the late teens and early 1920s of the 20th century. So it was magazines and also movies that created this as a cultural norm. Later, of course, it was the idea of total removal of body hair came in because of the mainstreaming of the lingerie business as well as pornography. Yes, women were looking at porn too and getting ideas of how they should groom themselves. So anyway, the thing is that Hollywood doesn't just promote things about how you should dress, but also how you should behave, how you should court, how the ideal male, the ideal female, how they should interact with one another. These are norms that weren't there necessarily. They came in because of what we see in the movies. And so, especially since we had a change in how things were operating, because now people were driving cars, they were more mobile. You weren't just having this, a date didn't mean that you just came and sat on the porch and talked, as it was in, for instance, the 1800s, but it became something where you could drive to another place. And so then Hollywood started throwing in the idea of the romance and the intrigue that was involved with that. And that became more of a norm. It threw in the way you should dress, so clothing styles changed. And this changed the morality. And yet, well, I should explain something that's quite interesting. Up until about the 1930s, if you actually look at movies, the irony is you could find movies that had nudity in them and stuff like that. And then there was this kind of push, mostly led by the Catholic Church, to have censorship boards. Now, that didn't stop movies from being made that were bad. It just meant that the movies that were made that were a little bit risque, they wound up in little trashy parts of town and so forth, or at someone's lodge on 8mm projector or something like that. And so that there was a certain morality that was put in, even though often if you watch old movies, you can see how they subtly, or even cartoons for that matter, some of the stuff you may have seen on Saturday mornings, if you actually analyze it, you're going, oh my gosh, that's what they were talking about in this cartoon. Because those cartoons were made for adults. They weren't made for kids. But the thing is, there was a certain control over them. But then something interesting happened. You did start getting some competition from other countries in the movie industry after, during the early 1960s. Plus, you even had a little bit of competition from the low budget movies that wound up in the other side of town sort of place. So the Hollywood actually suggested the idea of the rating system. And then that was pushed because, this will protect the kids, and yet adults can see what they want to watch. It's always protecting kids, isn't it? Anyway, what happened was we came into our modern rating system, but that was actually just an excuse to mean that, okay, now we can make stuff that's a little bit, it's going to be the same as that comes from Europe. It'll be a little bit more naughty, but you could say no one under 18 can come see this movie unless their parents approve of them being there and come with them. Like that ever worked? How many people? I mean, gosh, how many times did you ever get checked back in high school when you were 16 and wanted to go see an R-rated movie? Did that ever happen to anyone? I mean, really getting checked often. Often the person that was taking the ticket was someone you went to school with. They knew you weren't 18, and they still sold you the ticket. Back in those days when you would actually walk up to a real human being and buy a ticket to the theater. So anyway, the problem I think that happened though is you started this you started this idea that you gave a lot of power to directors and writers and so forth to start using film as a means of changing people's behavior. I mean, if you look at the sitcoms of the 1970s that many of us grew up on, you can see just how they were designed to change people's attitudes, kind of shift them away from a more conservative attitude on marriage, family, reproduction, careers, especially for women, all these other things. They were put into a role play, and essentially the sitcoms of the 70s are more of a education tool. They really are. Look at some of the old sitcoms. I mean, I'm trying to think of, because I was going to give some examples and maybe some exceptions, but I'm even thinking, no, they weren't exceptions. Just go and look up. Some of the sitcoms are on the internet, on YouTube, and then watch them, and you can actually see they weren't so subtle in those days about challenging the more conservative norms. Even when it came to religion, I still remember there was a sitcom in which a priest is in there, and the priest makes a comment, something said about an X-rated movie that I don't even know if it's X anymore. I mean, considering how things have changed with the rating system, but an X-rated movie that had gotten a lot of acclaim back in the mid or early 70s. And the priest comments that he saw the movie and he liked it. And, you're thinking, well, was this just thrown in just for ironic humor, or was it done to mainstream this idea that it's okay? So eventually we started seeing, not just in the 70s, but this carried on, and it carries on even today. If you watch film. Now, things are a little bit, okay, there's a difference. The stuff that's designed for more educated audiences tends to be very subtle in any kind of programming, so to speak, because more educated audiences don't like to be propagandized, and they can recognize it and they resent it even if they agree with the propaganda. They often don't want it just thrown in their face. The stuff that's designed for more general consumption, then you still see it. It's not as blatant as maybe in the 1970s, but it's still there. Now, this has created a certain schism between more conservative Americans and Hollywood, of course. But here's the problem. We have going back to the Industrial Revolution, we have all of this free time nowadays. In the old days, even if you were affluent, you didn't have a lot of spare time. You were taking care of the kids. Maybe you had 4 or 5 kids. You were having to do things around the house. Nowadays, people have 1 or 2 kids. Both are working. They come home. They're tired. But we have all these appliances that do much of our work for us. And a lot of times, it's cheap enough just to throw something that's processed, and we could deal with processed foods. But anyway, I have to say this before I go on. I just have to say this. I saw an article that was talking about processed foods, and the more processed they are, the more unhealthy they are recently. But I noticed that I can't eat processed foods very much anymore because it makes me kind of sick to my stomach. Because I'm used to exercising and eating right. If I eat highly processed foods, it just does something to me now. I don't know whether it's the genetically modified aspects to it that you get in a lot of processed foods. I don't know, but I just don't like it. But anyway, a lot of people, they're used to it. They throw something in the oven, open up a bag of corn chips, start munching in the living room, watching TV, because we have that kind of time. The last time I saw I'm sure the internet's taken away some of that. Last time I read, the average British or American person watches 5 hours of TV a day. So we often just kind of put aside the whole aspect of what we're watching may not be according to what we believe in. It might go against our religion, or it may make fun of our religion, especially if you're Catholic. It may make fun of your, the way that you would have your sons and daughters behave and so forth. It could be, I think the most big thing is, especially in movies, is the idea that adultery and that sort of thing is just kind of seen as not a big deal. And yet, I think most couples, unless you're a member of a swingers organization, would find adultery to be a big deal. Cheating and that sort of thing. And then, of course, the hookup culture that's thrown out there, and you can think, well, how many people that are single really live that lifestyle? Not that many. And yet on TV, it looks like if you're single and you're a guy, you're just getting all kinds of playboyish looking young women, spending time with you. If you're a woman, you're single, you're getting all these really handsome, guys that are paying attention to you. But in reality, that's quite rare. I mean, you just have to go into a singles bar or a nightclub, and usually what you see is not that great. Okay, it's really not as it's presented on television and in the movies. But we still watch it as a people, and think that it doesn't actually have an effect on us. And actually it does. It can have very much of an effect on us as time goes on. It's very subtle. And, it could be desired family size. By the way, I always do this. I know it's interrupting, but look up soap operas, family size, Latin America. Yeah, soap operas, family size, Latin America. And it was found, again, you show small families, you show people getting married at a later time, and these kinds of things, and people will adapt to that. Just what they see on TV. It becomes the reality. And so maybe you think, no, that's not me. I don't. Well, okay. Imagine what let's say you're 50 right now. Let's just imagine that. And you suddenly are able to take all the shows you watch and transfer them back to, if you could watch yourself, when you were 20 years old, 30 years ago. Okay? 30 years ago. And you are now watching what you watch today. What would be your reactions as a 20-year-old watching what you watch today? Would it be the same? Would you find it, yay, these are great shows? Or would you be like, wait a minute, wow, what is this? And you'd object to a lot of the stuff. Well, if it's objectionable, then that means, yes, you have become desensitized. Be it violence, be it illicit sex, be it whatever. You've become desensitized to it. Because the more you see something, the more you get used to it, and then the envelope can be pushed a little bit more. All right? I'm sure Hollywood directors would love to just say, okay, let's just do this kind of movie. But then they might think, how's that going to go over, and then they pull back. So, I mean, if you're doing a horror movie, I mean, can you imagine if you could just create it just like you'd really like to? But if you did, I don't think the average person that's out there would really appreciate it. And you wouldn't get as many people going to see your movie. So therefore, there is a constraint that is set in by not so much a morality that says this is wrong, but more of what's going to happen if I put this in. Will people freak out, and will less people want to see the movie? Very important point there. But then again, little by little, maybe 20 years from now, what you didn't dare put in, you'd go ahead and put in at that point. This is how it works. So our family sizes are affected. This is why if you go into the deep South, where people are really conservative, and it used to be, when you had a kid, that was God's blessings and so forth. Now, my understanding is that, you have more than 2 kids, people look at you funny. Okay. How did that happen? Organically? Or was it just suddenly a raised consciousness in some sort of way that told us that having more than a couple of kids was wrong? No. It's because that is what norms have been established by entertainment. All right? That's the norm. There's not that many shows out there that it's like, yay, we're going to have 4 kids now. Or something like that. It's just not that way. It's not presented that way. So people sit in front of that TV, they listen. Think about it. And people are still resisting me right now. I know it. I can sense it, and I'm not necessarily psychic on this. Think about this. If you sit in front of the TV and listen to math lectures as much as you watch entertainment, even if you weren't really paying attention, maybe you were doing other things at the same time the math lecture was going on, like texting a friend or something like that. 4 or 5 hours of math lectures every day, you're going to become good at math. It's just going to sink in eventually. All right? You're going to learn it. And the same is true for what you see coming out of Hollywood. So even though they're to the left, socially, culturally, politically, religiously, so forth, the population moves more and more their direction, because that is what they're watching. All right. Now, another so what do you do about that? Well, you should at least learn how to analyze film. Most people, you say, oh, by the way, I know how the end of this film is going to be because they're doing this right now. And people look at you like, stop it. They really don't like that. But people need to really be able to analyze film, see the bias. Understand it, and then it has less effect on you. If you don't know the bias, then it affects you in a deeper way. You're not able to say, oh, I see through what you're trying to do here, Mr. Director, and I don't like that. And maybe, I actually think this. I actually think that in the last few years, people have started catching on to this, and this is why less people are watching movies, and people are watching less TV. I really think people are becoming a little bit more aware, and this is something we need to continue pushing. Okay? You can be an expert on film analysis and still enjoy movies. Just like you could be an expert at music and still enjoy music. It just makes you a better consumer of it. And especially with your children, or your grandchildren, or your great-grandchildren. You should try to promote this idea. So they analyze commercials and TV shows and cartoons. Oh my gosh, to be honest, I still think that, if I had little kids today, like, 3, 4, 5 years of age, I would not let them watch cartoons today, because they seem to be more like, trying to promote something. I would just, pop in DVDs or whatever of Tom and Jerry and Bugs Bunny and those kinds of cartoons, right? Those kinds of things. And even older ones. Many you can find on the internet now. I would let them watch those. But another thing, the whole Me Too movement, when it comes to Hollywood, a lot of people really don't understand the connection between Hollywood and the porn industry. Now, I'm not saying that there's like this, they're all part of the same thing, or anything like that. But I remember one time I was visiting Los Angeles. I know someone that she partied in those circles, the higher Hollywood circles, where she could say, "Well, I was at a party with so and so and so and so and so and so," and you'd recognize all their names. And we were driving down the road one time, and we came through this one area that we didn't go through it, but we were pretty close to this one area that had in those days, had lots of strip clubs. And she said, you'd be really surprised with how many women that you see in TV shows work at these places. And I'm like, what? You gotta be joking. I mean, why wouldn't they be scared of getting caught or something? And she explained it, and it made a lot of sense. If you're only one of these people that you're not the big star, okay? You're not the big movie star that everyone recognizes the name of. But on your resume, you could put down, okay, I was in this TV show, I had a part in this one movie, and so forth. But maybe just in the movie, it's 30 seconds, or in this TV show, you were a travel agent as the couple is going on their dream vacation, or you were Johnny's teacher in a popular whatever, or Jane's, or you were just one of the students that's walking by, on a drama dealing with college or high school or something like that. And the thing is that that's where most actors and actresses are. And they're looking for their big break. They're looking for that one role where they can suddenly, be recognized, and someone goes, you know what? He or she is really, really, really someone I would like to have as the next, give her, instead of this 30-second role where she's taking the tickets and maybe has a few lines of the leading couple, she'll be in you'll give her maybe a much greater part where she'll be, maybe she'll have altogether 5 minutes in this other movie. That's what you're shooting for. But that doesn't pay the rent, especially in Southern California. It doesn't pay the rent, food, transportation. You have the problem when it comes to your hours. You have to have some sort of job that you can juggle the hours. And so while a lot of people, they come there with stars in their eyes going, wow, I'm going to be the next so-and-so in the movies. What happens is they go there and, they get just enough to kind of keep them going, but not enough to really make a major living. So they need something to supplement. And therefore, this is where maybe in the 1980s, which I was talking about, maybe being a stripper could give you something that, put enough makeup on and stuff, and no one's going to recognize you. Put on a wig, highlights, whatever. But then nowadays, it might be that you're not going anywhere, and you don't want to go home and try getting a job. You can't get the job at the hardware store that you had when you were, because it's probably gone now. So, there's this idea that, okay, well, your agent tells you that you can instead, you can keep trying to get these little parts and do this, but you can, at the same time, you could be making several $1,000s or more, whatever it is, a show by starring in these kinds of other movies. And so this is where I say there's a symbiotic relationship. You draw in all these young, attractive people that come to Hollywood to make it. But then there's an oversupply of them. So therefore, many of them can gravitate to these other related industries when it comes to entertainment. The other problem you have is, again, you've got an industry that is based on the idea that, maybe you have 100 people trying out for a part to a movie. And I'm not talking about the leading lady or a leading guy. By the way, when we're talking about the Me Too thing, it goes both ways. I mean, you got women who try to use their power to seduce young men. You've got the ones you hear about, of course, a lot, the men who use their power to seduce young women. You've got also men who are trying to seduce young men and women who are trying to seduce young women. I mean, it's in every respect. But at the same time, think about it. You've got all these people desperate for roles, and then you've got, something that's been part of the movie culture, the casting couch, ever since the whole thing began. So, that's another aspect. I just don't see, the glamour in it. I don't see why we should see any more glamour, glitz, or have any more respect for that industry than any other industry. In fact, less. I don't think, at least when you come to moral exploitation, where you're asking someone to maybe bend their morals, maybe, maybe they don't, they don't think of it in that way. But there's really, I would say they're less deserving of respect than what you would get in reference to an auto industry or tech firm or whatever. I really don't believe that they deserve any more than, that I don't think they deserve what they get. So does that mean that I think they should be regulated? That starts getting me a little worried about which direction, who does the regulation. But maybe just knowing, maybe just recognizing the system means it has less influence. So when you see movie stars and directors and so forth congratulating each other on, I hate to see people interviewed on so-called news programs, movie stars and that sort of thing, because I'm just like, why are they seen as experts on anything? Some actress drops out of high school and suddenly she's telling you about world politics, how it should be done. I mean, I seriously, I think that that's ridiculous. But yet we affix this to them, and they want this to continue. This is why, they really promote this idea that's larger than life, so to speak. Because if it ceases to be larger than life, if people just like, okay, well, just like when the old days, you go back several hundred years, actors and actresses, that did plays and so forth, that was seen as kind of a low job. I was like, oh, okay, well, that's what you do. Maybe we need to get back to that. I'm not saying that, they're the people that the directors and the producers and the actors and actresses are just, low lifes or anything. I'm just saying that they're not gods. They're not idols. They should not be seen as idols, because we know what happens to societies that worship idols. That society usually falls apart. So, I think there's just a few things I just wanted to, deal with here, because I think it's something that we really need to keep in mind when it comes to our media and when it comes to what is affecting how we think. Because once we know the influences that are out there that are trying to cause us to think a certain way or act a certain way, essentially you can be manipulated in one direction or another, then we're more in control of it. We're more in charge. All right. Otherwise, we are not in charge and we can't question, and therefore choice is yanked away from us. All right? And psychology is really, the ultimate tool psychology can provide us is the ability to analyze something and know where it's coming from, so therefore we are not susceptible to its influence. Well, I saw something interesting. Someone put this meme up on my Facebook page, and it was the question of what would things be like now if Hillary had been elected? And that, I think, is a quite interesting question, because sometimes it's hard to tell, what she would have done in regards to economics and so forth, and immigration, because her policies have shifted all over the place. I mean, if you take a look at what her stands have been throughout time, she seemed to go a little bit more left in the election in 2016, but I'm not certain there. But I am much more concerned with the fact that her foreign policy might have been somewhat, it could have been a lot different, especially in regards to issues such as Russia. Now, one problem I'm really having in regards to this whole Russian issue is, and I think she really pushed it when she lost the election, the whole it's the Russians' fault sort of thing, and then Trump made the mistake of hiring Mueller. I think that was a big mistake for Jeff Sessions just to kind of go dormant. I don't know where Jeff Sessions is. Has he been abducted by aliens? Is he in some sort of suspended animation someplace? Similar to that movie Idiocracy, where the soldier and the prostitute are put into deep freeze and they just kind of forget they're there, and they wake up 500 years later and everyone's really stupid. I'm not sure. It's just that it seems that he's kind of gone, and we don't hear much from him. But the thing is that I regardless of whether you love Trump, hate Trump, whatever, it was not the Russians that got him elected. But even if it had been the Russians, what would have been their motivations? See, that's one thing people forget about. The mainstream media forgets about this. What were the motivations if the Russians had really wanted Trump elected? And I think that's very simple. They were scared to death of Hillary. Not that Hillary was going to stop them from doing anything wrong or anything, but just this whole military aspect to her, the whole feeding into like the idea of setting up no-fly zones in Syria. I mean, already it seems that America is playing a very dangerous game under Trump by not just leaving Syria. I mean, as long as we're there, what's our objectives there? Is our objective to keep Syria completely fragmented? To make sure that various rebel forces still hold on to oil refineries? What are they going to do with it? I mean, what's the end game? I don't think America really has an end game, and I don't think it really had an end game, if it would have been Hillary getting elected. I think sometimes America just kind of jumps in and, doesn't quite understand what it's doing in a situation. Just that we're the world policeman. We need to go do something. We do something, and sometimes it's not enough. It's like giving an antibiotic to someone. The person's sick, they have a bacterial infection, so you're like, okay, well, this antibiotic will work. Got to do something. Well, the antibiotic you give could actually kill them if if it winds up disrupting the balance of bacteria in that person's body to where you actually knock out beneficial bacteria and the bad bacteria lives. That's why, they really caution against giving antibiotics to people just haphazardly. Like, oh, you're sick, here's an antibiotic, because you can actually make things worse. And I think American foreign policy is very similar to that. You don't know what your end game is. You go in to do something, and then what then? Well, then you're stuck. If you pull out, then anything that happens, like if Trump were to pull out of Syria right now, people would be like, and something went bad there, then people say, see, you shouldn't have left Syria. Look what's happened to it now. If you stay and something, happens bad, like you accidentally attack, Russians or whatever, instead of whatever force you're supposed to be battling. I don't know who you're supposed to be battling. Is America fighting ISIS anymore? Is it going to fight Turkey if Turkey decides to become belligerent? Is it going to fight the Syrian army? Are we at war with Syria? I mean, I don't know. Do you know? Does Trump know? But Hillary would have been, I think, a little bit. I mean, right now our troops are just kind of sitting there, and it seems like they're there, but they don't know what they're doing. Of course, they weren't sent there by Trump. They were sent there by Obama. Hillary, I think, would have been a little bit more in line with, maybe going to war with Syria, maybe going to war with Russia. And even if maybe she didn't want to do that initially, her policies would have resulted in that, because it was more of we're going to get them. But I think that we would wound up with just as much military spending, if not more, if Hillary had been elected. Now, economically, people are like, well, yeah, but what about economics? Hillary would be, more for the poor. Really? Have you seen, take a look at the welfare reform that Bill Clinton put in. A lot of people on the left still are kind of angry at that. When Clinton had to do it in order to get reelected, but at the same time, people felt it was a betrayal of the Democratic Party. I think actually Hillary in that area is fairly conservative for the most part. So I don't know if there really would have been any difference in the economics. So military, no difference. Economics, no difference. Socially, I think she would have put in the replacement for Justice Scalia. I think she would have put in someone that was more Democrat and more liberal. And in that area, I think that there would have been more of a turn to more liberal policies in the courts. I think that's really the only difference you would have seen in that sense. So if Hillary had been elected, yes, you would have had maybe a little bit more belligerent foreign policy, especially towards Russia. You would have had more liberals on the court, and therefore maybe more gun restrictions, although I don't think you would have seen gun confiscation. I think you would see more restrictions put on. And so forth. At least the precedent would have been set. And when it came to issues relating to, if the courts ever decide on, again, abortion or things like that, of course, there'd be differences there. And I think the big difference will come in if the next Supreme Court opening that takes place, especially if it's one of the liberals that was put in by Obama. If they need to be replaced, then you're going to see a major change in the direction of the courts. And so there's the only area that I think you would, at least domestically, that you would have seen any differences that would have been major between Trump and between Hillary. A little bit more support for globalist type economic policy in regards to trade